Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And boy, have we got a good show for you today, because we have three incredible guests to talk about the SAS, both their wartime exploits, how they are regarded today. Everybody's talking about the SAS again because of the BBC series Rogue Heroes. And I'm thinking in my own life, there have been peaks where the SAS have been talked about. When I was 11, it was the Iranian embassy siege. Then there was things in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now the BBC has taken it all back to the beginning and the foundation of the unit back in World War II. And if you were with us yesterday for the rather kind of distressing talk about the Nanjing massacre, we're hoping today's show will be a little bit lighter. I mean, obviously we're talking about conflict, so there will be some talk about, heroism and gallantry and warfare and death. But the kind of, as it's a week away from Christmas, we are going to kind of keep things really light. But my guests, I don't really need to introduce them because you know exactly who they are. Damien Lewis, S.A.S, Powell and Chris Ryan. Between them, they've written numerous books. They are absolute experts on the S.A.S, two having served with the regiment, one having written about them and been in theatre as a journalist. So I couldn't ask for three people better to talk about it. I'll bring them in now. So good evening, guys. How are we all today?
Fine. How are you?
Feeling very festive.
Fine. So I've got a list of questions that we're going to kind of thrash through tonight, but I hope the conversation kind of goes a bit kind of free flowing and sprawling. And the fact is, the SAS, as I said there in the opening bit, is on everybody's lips again. Twitter and social media is talking about the exploits, both past and present. So my first question to you all is, for those who perhaps not British or the American viewers, Canadian viewers, anywhere around the world, the SAS is one of many, many units we would now call special forces. What sets the SAS apart? There's a good opening question. So I'll start with Damien, the other non-veteran, then I'll move to Chris and Des. So Damien, you've written numerous books about them. You've written about other units. You've written about the French Resistance. You've talked about other units that are in the early stages of special forces. But the SAS, what about them sets them apart?
They were first. They ploughed the furrow. I mean, they set the precedent. They were the founders. So they're the father of all special forces units in the world. One can argue, and it's largely true. I mean, I remember meeting one of the guys who founded Delta Force, and they went through SAS selection. They put themselves through SAS selection to learn how to do it, so they could found their own unit. So that's really the standout quality for me when you compare them to other units around the world.
That's a good opening start. So, Chris, I'll turn to you next, then Des. So, Chris, you've written about them both non-fiction, fiction. You've talked about the regiment at talks to other units. You've travelled around the world. Your answer to the same question: what sets the SAS apart?
Yeah, as Damien said, they were the first special forces unit. But uniquely, it's their selection process. Now, selection runs for nearly 6 months. And what we do, it's a very simple process, first of all. We test the individuals under arduous conditions. So guys come from all three services. We get them on the hills, and we put them under some extreme tests as individuals, not as groups. There's nobody shouting at them. They're just asked to walk from A to B, and as the days go on, the distances get longer, the weights that they're carrying become heavier. Now, after that period, you're left with a bunch of determined individuals. You probably lost half the course. Then we take them to the jungle, and the jungle is a very important part of selection. The jungle in itself is a hostile environment just for a human being to survive, never mind work. So the students are taught every standard operating procedure under the canopy, and they put that into practice. They're taught navigational skills, because as you can imagine, that's really difficult to walk from A to B when you can't see more than 2 meters in front of you. Now, again, when you're in the jungle, you're either walking downhill or uphill. It's very difficult, very demanding, physically demanding. And there's a psychological element to this point as well. Some people get in there and they'll become very claustrophobic. Maybe they don't like being dirty, sweaty, wet all the time. Parts of your body starts to rot. So the individual soldier has to be very disciplined in looking after himself. Then he's faced with all this information that's given to him. and then he has to put it into practice. Now, as an instructor, you look into the souls of these students, and you probably know them better than your families. You know their strengths and certainly their weaknesses. Then we move on to combat survival, where we put them under pressure, and then they're subject to resistance to interrogation. And then it is continuation training. And continuation training, again, you're thrown into the deep end, and this information is coming to you. And all along through this process, guys are putting their hands up and saying, it's not for me. The instructors will be saying, this guy's not suitable for the regiment. So when at the end, you are left with a product that can actually go into a Sabre Squadron's patrol and operate on an operational basis.
Well, that's a great answer.
Well, nobody does it better than the SAS, not even Delta.
And what's interesting is, having just read Damien's last book, and we talked about on the show there, is that in many ways you could be describing exactly what the guys were doing out in the desert in the early formation. It was lots of time sifting out, going, okay, it wasn't as organized. It wasn't in the sense that they hadn't got these methods complete yet, but the core way it was going to work was there at the beginning. And I think we'll bring Damien to talk about that. But Des, you were parachute regiment before you went to SAS, so you have a bit of knowledge of some fairly decent units there. So again, what in your case as an NCO, what makes the SAS special?
Yeah, carrying on what Chris said there about selection, what is interesting about selection is that the selection process actually picks the man itself. As Chris was saying there, when you put a certain person under heavy mental stress, heavy physical stress, and stresses of sleep deprivation and the like, it brings about the real person, if you like. And also is that it brings about a British Tommy Second World War attitude. In other words, don't expect anything. I've decided to be I volunteered. Let's get the job done type process. I think there's a few other things that adds to the selection process is that we come from the Northern Hemisphere and we have a down-to-earth approach on life. We have this kind of common sense. We don't depend on anything. We know that we're not going to get any help. I think in the SAS, it says on the can is that we know that we're going to be in very, very arduous, tough, stressful situations. So that selection process that Chris talks about brings that certain person around. As you can appreciate, to be in the SAS, you've got to have a certain mindset. You've got to have this less get the job done attitude. It's a stoic type mindset. And I think because in the Northern Hemisphere, we have that in us already. And as Damien said earlier on, is that we were the first unit to come about. And I think because we're an island, we're from the Northern Hemisphere, we have this down to earth approach on life. I think the selection process brings us about and actually brings about that SAS individual, that who dare win spirit, if you like. Hopefully that's answered the question.
No, it definitely has. And the fact you mentioned that the World War II Tommy there, I'm going to skip straight to the question I had for number 4, which is for serving members or members in your era, you guys, how much was the World War II story important to you? I mean, Maine, Sterling, we could list all those legendary figures. They clearly loom large. And then you in your eras made your own heroes. And we'll talk about who some of your own inspirations and favorite quote unquote SAS heroes are. But the World War II guys that paved the way, how important are they to you personally, and how important are they to the current serving members and people who are aspiring to be a member of the SAS? Do you want to chime in on that, Chris?
Yeah, no, I mean, they certainly were. I met Sterling and several of the originals, as I said, on the 50th anniversary. And these guys, just talking to them, asking them about the kit and everything else, the conversation was exactly the same as if you were talking to a guy who'd been in the regiment 5 years before you. We are the same animals running right the way through. We have that DNA. Now, again, reading about them, I used to ask about Colonel Maine, other characters Jock Lewis, who are no longer with us, and at that time. But speaking about the operations, what has changed, and it is the change of the outside influences in our life. And I hate saying this woke word, but back in them days, I can remember Reg Seekings speaking to me in Pontralis on that mission where they jumped in. A lot of guys were injured, broken backs, broken legs. And he said, I just went up to them, shook their hands, asked them if they wanted me to end it there and then or leave them around for them to shoot themselves. And it was that matter of fact. Now, if we try to say that in this day and age, you'd be booed off the stage, but you would have an inquiry on you. And these guys knew how difficult, how hard it was, and how life-threatening. And the fact that they got on that aircraft knowing that half of them certainly won't survive it. They were absolute, pioneers. These are the guys that's, the first guy that climbed Everest, or, the guy that walked across the Arctic. They took it and were prepared to die. But another thing as well, which is important, which I think we missed on that program, is the climate in Great Britain. Battle of Britain had been fought and won. Dunkirk had happened. We were actually on our knees, and the Nazis were spreading. So there was this sense of somebody's got to get involved with this fight. Somebody's got to go and sort these people out. And when you put that in, and then think of how life was back then, you can understand the brutality. So when somebody's saying, "Oh, I thought it was very, very bad form for Paddy Mayne to, open the door of a cookhouse and start shooting these pilots," he realized that they could destroy as many planes as they wanted, but the pilots took longer to train, so you could knock them down as well. And listen, war, you go there to kill, and that's a sad fact of life. And that's why I respect these guys with the utmost. I think they were gods to me.
Well, I mean, that's a good point to bring Damien in, because when we last spoke, Damien, we talked about the latest book and that early era. But we're looking at them through the lens of 2022. Chris said it himself. Now it's not the same era now. We live in a very different world now, and the rules of warfare, if there is such a thing as rules of warfare, but they're definitely perceived to be different now than they were back then. So, you've written about the regiment mostly in World War II, but you've also been alongside serving members in war zones. So, should we be measuring what they did in World War II by today's standards?
Well, actually, I'm curious to just kind of throw out the question back at you and the guys, because what Chris said there is bang on, absolute nail on the head. So that mission you're talking about, Chris, is Operation Squatter. It was their first. So 60 guys went in, around 60, 22 came back. The rest were injured or captured or killed, or just missing in action. No one ever found out what happened to them. But the key thing is that moment you described where Reg Seekings had to leave the wounded and said, "Do you want me to shoot you, or do you want to just be left to shoot yourselves or be captured?" They had decided right at the start. They decided as a unit that, the founders, the originals, if we have to leave guys behind because they're too badly injured, we leave guys behind. It wasn't a debate. There wasn't even a great deal of angst about it. It was just a matter of fact. That is the policy of the unit that we are founding and forging, and they did that for exactly the reason you pointed out. We were on our bloody knees. As you know, we were the last dog in the fight. The Nazis were triumphant just on about every land battle. Okay, not the Battle of Britain, but every land battle. And the desperate times required desperate measures. So on that level, I'm curious: is that something that at all would be taught and would be policy and palatable today? That's the first thing. Second thing is, when Paddy Mayne went in and shot up that officer's mess, you're absolutely right. Destroying warplanes, that's great, but if you destroy the pilots, it's even more effective, because it takes longer and is more expensive to train a pilot than to build a Messerschmitt. But there's another point there too, and again, I'm curious as to what your views are on this. Churchill said very clearly, "You are to go out and butcher and bolt raids, leave a trail of German corpses in your wake. murder the enemy and then away. No German will be left, should be allowed to sleep soundly in their beds at night. Is that kind of language and those kind of policies, is that something that we can openly espouse and promote and portray today? Or are those things which, in our modern era, where we're casualty averse and risk averse and all those things, we just can't put out there in the open? I mean, guys, I'm curious. Tell me what your thoughts are.
Let's do Des first.
Yeah, it's very difficult today, isn't it? I think, with different generations, I think in the Second World War, when these shores were threatened, and I think we had, different people then, and we've just talked about it there, about what had to be done. We have a different society today. I know we talk about the snowflake society, don't we? I think back then in the Second World War, and you mentioned about that we're actually losing, and Churchill come about and said, look, we need to do what we have to do. And I think then, we had different people, we had a different mindset than we do today. I think if we come up with that attitude and said, well, we will do this and we will do that and we will go ahead and we will leave corpses behind us, I think it would be unacceptable today. I don't think we would get the support, particularly of the regiment, that we did back then. And I can't say I agree with it. As I've talked earlier about, we have an attitude in the regiment of getting the job done, and whatever needs to be done, we do. But today there's a different view, particularly on the armed forces as a whole. But we're talking about the regiment, and I think the guys of the regiment then are still the same today, but whether it would be accepted openly, talking about it as we are, is another thing.
And Chris?
Well, everybody's accountable now, and we work under the guidelines of the Geneva Convention. And we have seen, not just with special forces, with ordinary infantrymen being hounded by solicitors after the fact, trying to get a prosecution, working on statements from unreliable sources, people that they paid to give them information. So yes, the game has changed. The game of war has certainly changed. Now we have footages. We have journalists embedded into units going in, and again we saw prosecutions and custodial sentences sent out in America to some of the American Marines that were in Iraq. So no, it has changed. I would say it was a free spirit in the Second World War, but now every man has to do his duty and correctly as well. In fact, actually, the regiment has just gone through one investigation from working in Afghanistan, which is, I think if you're sensible and you think about it, we were at war. We were losing a lot of soldiers to IEDs, and a lot of these guys that were arrested or neutralized were bomb makers, IED makers, and the such like. So no, the regiment work under different rules, and to them, the rules of engagement have certainly changed.
Can I just jump in with a supplementary question? Sorry, it's all right. Yeah, guys, I just wanted to ask, if you, when you were soldiering in your 2 decades you were in, or whatever it was, if you had been told that and I don't know, maybe you were, maybe you can't answer this question, but just answer it theoretically. If you'd been told, look, if we're in a situation where the operational requirements, in other words, to complete our mission, we will have to leave the badly wounded behind. And I've just been writing actually a section of a new book where it's after Operation Bigamy, where they go into raid Benghazi, and it's a complete disaster. But they're ordered to do it, and it sins against every founding precept of the SAS. There's no surprise. It's a mass attack. The enemy know they're coming, but they're told to go in and do it anyway. They get absolutely hammered from the air. They've got lots of badly wounded, and they do have to leave 4 guys behind. This is in autumn of 42, and those they leave behind. And a medic, one of the SS medic, volunteers to stay behind with a really badly wounded, because they can't take them. They just don't have the space on the surviving vehicles. All that distance back across the desert, they just can't do it. So they leave them, and a medic volunteers to stay behind and take them, to Benghazi, to take them to the enemy, to say Geneva Convention. All of them disappear. No one's ever found out that. Of course, they all died. No one ever found out how or why. Even the medic who stayed to protect them. So I'm just curious, do you understand, and would you support, if you can put yourself in that situation, that order and that necessity? Sometimes the mission will require us to leave the wounded behind.
Well, I would say, Des knows this. When I got onto the chopper in the first Gulf conflict, I said to the squadron quartermaster, "This is a one-way ticket, and when it goes bad, which it will, there's a good chance we're all going to die." But the bottom line is, I was in the SAS, so even with that risk, I still, had a duty to get onto that chopper. And Des knows other stories of guys who were told that, if this goes wrong, we'll lose people. And you all know that. I've got a sense that one of the strengths of an SAS soldier is he's a bit of a gambler, and not from a financial side. He's a gambler with his life. He's a gambler with the odds. So when we're going in onto a target, we're gambling because we know everything's stacked against us. And that's it. I mean, I had this, I'll not name the guy, this guy saying, "Listen, Geordie, are you getting a bit twitchy?" And I went, "No, I'm still getting on the chopper, but we don't have the right kit. We don't have the right information. We have nothing." And that is an SAS soldier. I mean, Des, you know other stories of, guys knowing that it could be a one-way mission.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking. I mean, me and Damien's written the book Bravo 30, and Chris was in Bravo 20, and we used to laugh tongue in cheek. We used to talk about, this is a one-way trip. This is a suicide mission. I've actually said that in the book, and we're getting on the chopper. As I said earlier on, the SAS, it says what it does on the side of the can. You know that you're going to get in serious situations. They're going to be stressful. There's a chance that some of the missions you're going to go on, that people are going to get injured and killed. And in this case, when we went out, Bravo 30 out in the Gulf, we went out on a mission that was almost impossible. We were going out there to find scuds, needle in a haystack, out in the middle of the desert, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. And we were expected to find these scuds, stay covert, relay the information back to headquarters so we could bring in airstrikes, and then get out there undetected and return. Well, in the stories of Bravo 30 and 20, you already see that it didn't go to plan. So yes, we always know that there's a chance of guys dying or losing our lives, but then again, as I've always said, is that it's a volunteer process. You don't have to be there. You don't have to be in the SAS. We volunteer. We know what we're going out to do. It's going to be very, very dangerous. But, as Chris said there, we know what was going to happen. We knew there was a chance that some of us weren't going to come back. But we still went forward and got on the helicopter. After all, we're SAS. We can't just turn around all of a sudden and say, "Oh no, I don't want to do that." We'll cherry pick.
It's raining. Let's not go. Yeah. And I think you hit something really important there, Des, about this, that often the mission goes wrong, because as Damien can attest, in World War II and in eras that followed, a lot of special forces missions, operations did go wrong. That seems that a lot go very well, but a lot have gone well. And I think it's that gambling aspect that Chris mentioned, is that you don't use a unit like the SAS for things that anybody could do. You send them for the things that need someone to take that risk, and it's a 50-50. It's a coin toss. So you send in those people who may get it done, and that goes back to the World War II. We are a World War II channel, so I need to keep bringing it back to World War II. So Damien, it seems to me that everything that Des and Chris is talking about, the seeds of the way to do things, were there right at the very beginning. The Jock Lewises, the Sterlings, Bill and David, the Colonel, all those guys were exhibiting the same qualities of knowing the risk, knowing that it may not be perfect, you may not have the best equipment, you may not have the right the intelligence you need, but you go ahead and do it anyway. So it was there right at the beginning. But did those pioneers know that they were setting up something that was going to be something we're still talking about 82, 83 years on, Damien?
Not at all, no, and quite the reverse, actually. I mean, and this is something that the Des and Chris will be, painfully aware of, because their unit almost, never came to pass. It never came to pass because they were deeply unpopular. And why were they deeply unpopular? Well, because they were an egalitarian unit. And guys, you can talk about that, because I'm sure that's still the case today. So they, rank didn't matter, merit mattered. They were, you could have been a lord, from the wilds of Scotland with a 1,000-acre estate, or you could have been a bricklayer from Wigan, or you could have been an actor from the West End stage, or anything in between. It didn't matter what your background was. If you had those key elements that it took to volunteer and step forward and be one of those operators, you were welcome. And your rank didn't matter. What mattered was your ability to lead. And again, guys, I'd be fascinated on your take on this. When I was talking on a program, Radio 5, yesterday or the day before, and I was trying to explain, look, and guys, again, I'd really like your insight into this would be amazing. So, and I'll just mention Paddy Mayne, because he was Colonel Paddy Mayne, DSO, because he was the doyen of this. Okay, you're taking a small patrol of men, let's say 12, let's say 20, whatever it might be, in a few jeeps or on foot, deep behind enemy lines, sometimes going for several months on end, not only undertaking these impossible missions to blow up any enemy airfields and all the rest of it, but not knowing if you're going to get back, not knowing if you're going to get stranded in the desert, not knowing if you're going to die of thirst or starvation or get captured by the enemy and tortured to death. It's my view, from having written as much as I have about World War II, you can't order men to follow you on those kind of missions. They are so extreme, and they require such dedication and such, commonality of purpose. You have to lead by example. You have to lead by building an association and a closeness with your men that they would follow you into the jaws of hell itself. And that's what studying Paddy Mayne in particular, and what his men said about him and wrote about him, that's what he excelled at, was this ability to lead men by inspiration and commonality and esprit de corps. And he, Sterling was the same, actually. Have I ever come across an example of Sterling ordering guys to go on a mission? No, he says, wouldn't it be a fantastic idea if maybe we just popped across the desert and did X? And it's suggestion, it's commonality, it's esprit de corps. We're all in this together, and that takes a very specific type of individual and a very specific type of bond between this band of brothers. So for all those reasons, they were deeply unpopular. This wasn't how soldiering was done in the British Army, because officers were officers, other ranks were other ranks, and that was the holy divide. And this freewheeling piratical brotherhood that the S.A.S became was antithetical to most of the British higher command. So many times, going back to your question, so many efforts were made to disband them and get rid of them, even before they'd finished the war in North Africa.
Mm. So, Chris, I thought you were going to jump in and react to Damien's comments there, but
well, I think, listen, the motto says it all: who dares wins. Now, these guys wanted to be part of a unit that was actually going to make a difference. They were lions. In some cases, they came from units being lions led by lambs. Now, one thing about Colonel Mayne, he was a guy that never asked anything of his men that he would never do. So he was the type of officer I wish I'd had, because I would have followed them to the ends of earth. And this is a big thing. Now, there was a massive change later on when the regiment was reformed. A lot of operations were run by corporals, sergeants, and staff sergeants, and very few officers. The officers would stay back in command. And that went right the way through to really when Des and I were serving. I've got a funny story, and it was actually with Des. We were off on a German language course, and this is how stupid it is, but it's how arrogant really the SAS soldiers are. So we were cutting around this infantry camp. We were doing, as I said, German for a week. We were coming back from a shop. I had my hands in my pockets, no berry on. I think Des was exactly the same. We passed two officers, we walked past them, and they turned around, stopped us, tried to tell us off, but not saluting an officer, and then said, "Where's your berries?" And I actually think Des said, "F on," like that. We went back into camp. Now we had an ex-ranker, Bronco Lane. He was on this course. He was a captain. He'd actually been the RSM. And we're sat in the classroom, and we see these two officers come to the door, knock on the door. Bronco goes outside, and all I could hear him saying, "If that's all you've got to complain about, you're in the wrong unit. Now get lost." He was a lot more aggressive than that. But that's what you have to put up with. You know, when the army obviously is structured and led in a certain way because of historical tactics and everything else, the SAS removed themselves from that. But what you have to remember is they're still under, they're still commanded by the British Army. But we didn't care about the silly things of marching, having shiny boots, sticking your hand up, doing whatever. Basically, we were looking at, right, how do we get on site? How do we attack this target? How do we destroy this thing? How do we extract? What happens if it goes wrong? The bigger problems. We never worried about the small stuff. And I still think today, on Remembrance Day, the military, you see them come out as a regiment. They get the crowds and the families all come out onto the parade square. The regiment comes walking out, does all the movements and everything else. The regiment have a unique way of doing it. They keep the families and the audience away. They get the guys up there, form them up into a square box, and then bring the families to them whilst they're all standing. Get rid of the families so there's no drill or anything. It's quite comical, actually. So don't worry about the little things. Worry about the big things.
So it looks like we're not going to ever see the SAS doing the trooping of the colour and doing that kind of thing in the ceremonial stuff in London. That's not in your strengths.
No, not at all. Not at all.
But and I was watching Desi's smiling when you were telling that story about the berets there. But you're right there, Damien. There's definitely this idea that it's a classless environment. It was a classless unit. That the British Army was hampered by class throughout World War II and on into the following decades. But we mentioned Colonel Mayne there, and of course he looms large as a lot of these founding members do in our memories today. But the question I want to ask you is, who are other unsung heroes in the SAS that the world should know about? We can roll off these names, Reg Seeking, as you mentioned there, Chris, earlier, but either from World War II or from other eras. Des, give us an SAS hero of yours that you think the world should know about.
And I suppose I'm being very basic here. I know we talk a lot about Paddy Mayne, but when we talk about Paddy Mayne, I like to talk about David Sterling and Jock Lewis. I mean, these three guys were pivotal forming the regiment. In fact, I think it was Sterling that said that Paddy Mayne and Jock Lewis, could have formed the regiment just the same as I could. And I think, they're all three of them are joined at the hip, aren't they? So I don't like picking out any particular one. I mean, I know we have the 60 originals and these guys within them originals that, form the SAS, but I don't have any particular one. I think Damien is very good. He talks a lot about the history of the regiment, especially the book he's just brought out he talks a lot about Paddy Mayne, and I think it's good that he's done that, because a lot has been written about Paddy Mayne, which is probably untrue. And I think Damien, because he knows his family and he's been able to get it straight from the horse's mouth, sort of thing. I think Damien has written about Paddy Mayne, and as it is the true sort of thing. And I think that Damien being a historian, and I know when he written a book with me, he's very fussy about getting things right. I think what he's written about Paddy Mayne is bang on. But when we talk about answering your question about anyone that stands out for me, they're the three. I look at those as being joined at the hip. These were the guys that formed the regiment, and I don't like talking about any particular guy. So these three for me are the ones that form the regiment, the S.A.S. and the esprit de corps and the who dares wins and everything that comes with it. And by the way, I remember the story that Chris said, and there was something, just going back to Chris's or Damien's question, is that I remember when I become a staff sergeant in the regiment, and the RSM come up to me and he says, "Welcome to the most exclusive club in the world." And I kind of frowned at him, and he says, "Well, the regiment is run by the sergeants and staff sergeants, not by the officers." And I think it's the officers used to come to us, stay with us only for a couple of years, but obviously the sergeant, staff sergeants are the heart of the regiment. That is where the experience is, and that is what. And whenever there's a mission, the officers give us the orders, but it's the sergeant, staff sergeants that decide how the mission and the task is carried out. So the regiment, the heart of the regiment, where the experience is from the sergeants and the staff sergeants, even though we have the officers as let's say the leaders, if you like, but they're only with the regiment temporarily. They have a route. Their career goes in a different direction. When, such as me and Chris joined the regiment, we're in it for life. Me and Chris both had long careers there, and you can see, common sense wise, is that the experience is with the soldiers on the ground, particularly the sergeants and the staff sergeants.
Brilliant response. And Chris, who are your heroes within the regiment?
Oh, well, without it sounding like a cliche, I would say every trooper in the SAS. You can't pick one guy out. And, it's like an operation. There could be anything from 3 guys to 16 guys to a squadron there. Every man is doing the job. Obviously, there's certain operations where individuals do something and they stand out. But I think every man that puts his name down to do selection, he passes, and then he contributes to being in that regiment is a hero. I mean, just look at the guys now. Their workload is unbelievably heavy, and it changes as well. So these guys can adapt. But yeah, I can't pick. It would be unfair to pick out one individual. I would just say every single guy.
Okay. Well, I'm going to deviate off my set of questions, but because it's something that's come to mind now, and we talked about at the beginning about the BBC series, and we'll come back to what your thoughts on that are sometime later in the show. But as I said, it's bringing the SAS to the forefront. Everyone's talking about them, and people, you said it yourself, Des, people are making decisions. They're saying things about Colonel Mayne that maybe are unsubstantiated. Damien has done the research there. People, once you've done a certain number of things, you become public property to a certain extent, and everybody has an opinion about the SAS. So the particular question I think is worth giving to you guys from your history explorers watching is, can the guys talk about what they miss out on by being so open with their service? I know it is sometimes frowned upon, and is PNG a real policy? You guys and Damien, you've been on combat tours. Anyone who talks about the regiment in the public arena as you have done, is there a negative side about doing that? Chris, for example?
No, I mean, obviously, there's certain operations that you cannot speak about, and that's a fact. Current operations. Now, the joke with my the one that got away, when I had done that, General de Villiers had, when I was a surging sergeant, I was forced to give him my story, and it just seemed to be, if it was an officer, he was writing about his memoirs. If it was a serving other rank, he was selling secrets, and it wasn't fair. And on top of that, two men who enforced the disclosure agreement did not sign it because they knew that they were going to write books, and that was Radcliffe, the RSM, and Cedric Delves, who had been a director of the SAS. So it's a hypocrisy, and whenever you do that, it just smacks of them and us, and it leaves a bad taste in the mouth. But again, whenever I think the rule is, if you're going to talk about the SAS, you don't talk about any current operations, any procedures that are current. Now, by watching this program on the originals, we're not damaging the SAS. In fact, the SAS brand has just gone through the roof. Donations to the Clock Tower Fund, to squadron funds, and everything else. So, no matter how much you try to kid you, everybody's winning here. And also, it goes right up to the MOD on funding for the regiment and development for the regiment. For having that brand, I mean, their brand was put on the forefront when obviously we did when the B Squadron entered the Iranian embassy. You can't unsee that. You can't just step back and pretend that this unit doesn't exist. You just have to develop it and move on, but be sensible about it as well. I mean, there's one chap who was involved in the Kenyan raid. He was on, there was footage of him going in there. He killed 4 terrorists. He led the siege after 17 hours, and all he wanted to do is write about that because his ID had been, it was on the internet. His face was on the internet and everything, and they put a D notice on it, and he wasn't allowed to do it. And whenever you get that, that information comes out under the wrong channels. But yeah, that's it.
Great response. And I want to bring it back, Damien and Desian, well, all of you in again. And it's something Damien and I have talked about repeatedly when he's been a guest on my channel is measuring the success of special forces operations, because there can be that immediate military success, but then there's this what it can do for the public. And part of the exploits of the SAS in World War II and other special forces was not so much what they actually achieved, but what the public thought they achieved. I mean, things like the Doolittle raid, which isn't really special forces, but it kind of is. The raid on the aqueduct in Italy is what the public perceive. So, Damien, when you're writing about a unit like the SAS, you've got to take into consideration the public perception. As Chris said there, as an 11-year-old boy I was when the Iranian embassy, watching that live, if I could have signed up for the SAS at 11 years old, I'd have been down, I would have known what I was doing. But the pride I felt in my country, it sounds like cliche, it sounds like I'm absolutely sincere. When I saw that, I never felt prouder to be British and think those guys represent my country. So, Damien, where are you on this? And with measuring of the success of the raid, there's different ways of doing it. It's about the military success, and it's about this, what it does for the country, what it does to boost morale.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just picking up on what Chris said, every manuscript that any SAS guy writes, or indeed that I write, has to be cleared through the MOD. So if it's reasonably contemporary, so that is a filter it goes through to make sure it's absolutely going to cause no security issues or detriment to the SAS. And more to the point, in terms of recruitment and retention, the more this brand is boosted, as we've been talking about, the more that's going to be a very real thing. And in answer to your question, Paul, yeah, of course. Look, when Churchill, called for his special duty volunteers, his, volunteers for hazardous duties, which was the start of of special service. Okay, and then the SAS were born out of that, which was 48 hours after Dunkirk, just so we give Churchill his absolute due, because when we were facing Armageddon, defeat in France and this island about to fall, this island nation, he said, no, we're going to go on the attack, and I want special service volunteers to step forward to do that. But when he did that, he knew that actually probably the greatest benefit would not be military, would not be in military terms, but in propaganda terms, in terms of morale. So I'll give you an example. He called for special duty volunteers and he said, I want to raid back across the channel by the end of the month. So it was around about the 8th of June when he called for that. So by the end of the June, now no one had waged war like this before. We had no recruits, no equipment, no tactics, techniques, procedures, no training. Yet they got a raid across the channel by the end of the month in a bunch of RAF crash boats. They took 90 guys across. They shot up a German outpost, seized a prisoner. In the greater fortunes of the war at that time, it was insignificant, utterly insignificant. However, it was headline news in the British newspapers the next day, and it gave the British people the confidence and the belief that we could fight back. And not only that, that evening it was headline news in America, and the headlines were British bulldog finds its bark. So the Americans started to think, yes, maybe maybe the war maybe the Nazis haven't actually won and Britain's going to cave. That is absolutely essential. And in North Africa, by the end of the North Africa campaign, 400 odd warplanes destroyed on the ground by the SAS. Phenomenal achievement, absolutely war-winning outcome. But the actual morale and propaganda achievements are legion with these kind of operations.
So
with any type of operation, you're absolutely right, Damien. A war can be won or lost with bad morale. And if the morale, you look at, say, Vietnam as an excellent example, morale was down and all that negative news was coming out of Vietnam and the troops weren't being supported by their country. And that was all down to, the media and there was no morale and no taste for the fight. And that's where it can be very dangerous. In fact, think of the Spaghetti House siege in London, when they phoned in and said, if you don't come out now, the SAS are coming. The SAS weren't even in town, and all them weapons got thrown out and came out with their hands up.
Yeah.
So it does work.
No, definitely. So to expand on this idea, because there's a couple of questions came in that I'd like to expand on. Sean Brennan is asking, how does the organization deal with the cognitive dissonance of being a secretive operations group and the brand of the SAS being a benefit to British forces? There's a paradox there in that the country needs you to go and do these incredible things where you kick down doors and wear the black and do all these incredible things. But at the same time, you are a secretive organization. So how does that work? How can you be both of those things at the same time, Des?
Let's put it together. And there's a morale thing here. I'm answering the question, and there's this thing, isn't there, about the SAS arguably is the most successful special forces unit in the world, and the morale thing is that I've been involved in conflicts, and I've heard soldiers from other countries saying, is the UK going to get involved in this? Or the SAS going to get involved in this? And they say, yeah. And they say, oh, thank goodness, I'm glad they're getting involved. So the morale thing there really works. Even when I talk around the country, I can see the respect that I get from the civilians, if you like, civvy street, as we call it, to us military, ex-military guys, that they give towards me. And it's not me, it's what I represent, isn't it, the SAS. So the morale thing there is fantastic. In other words, the UK is behind the SAS, the British Forces unit. And the rest of the world, the story just told you that I've heard units say, oh, the SAS getting involved in this. So I think it's good for us, the UK, it's good for morale to have a unit like the SAS. Touching on what we said earlier on and answering the question about a secretive organization or whether we should talk about this, that, and the other. I think there's a common sense approach that we have to here. I think it's good that we can pull out the SAS and say that we have done this, we have fought against tyranny, and we have won, and we have managed to bring about a positive outcome to this particularly tense situation or this conflict. So I think that works quite well. When we get into details about telling stories about certain operations, then I think we have to have a common sense approach, what Chris said earlier on. For my story, Bravo 30 and Chris's, Bravo 20, these were already well documented, and they were already, quite a few years ago. So I know that it was looked upon differently, but yes, talking about today's operations, is definitely a no-no, simply because we've got guys that are still serving and still carrying these things out. It is very, very difficult. There's this tightrope answering the questions that the gent asked earlier on about having an organization talking about what we've done and then being secretive about it. There's a very, very fine line that we walk, and I think we have to be very, very careful not to let too much go, because it gets watered down, doesn't it? And I think that our strength, if you like, in the SAS is being quite secretive. Is being covert to a certain extent. Yes, it's nice, as Chris says, we can't say that we don't exist, but what we can be careful of is giving out information that could be detrimental to the regiment itself. Makes sense.
No,
well, actually, on that, we do have a disclosure wing that was formed to look at social media, books, TV, anything that's going out to the public. And if they deem that there's a danger of, a leak of any type of, anything to do with special forces, they can close it down and stick a D notice on that. I know Damien will know all about that department.
Yeah, I mean, I've had lots of dealings with them, and I've always found them very straightforward. I wrote a book many years ago called Operation Certain Death. It's about the Operation Barras, the hostage rescue mission in Sierra Leone, guys, which you will know intimately. Obviously, where the S.A.S went in with the Paras in support, and obviously SBS as well, and rescued British hostages, British soldiers held hostage by the West Side Boys, the Sierra Leonean rebels. And I remember when I submitted that manuscript, and I got a letter back from, I think it was a Rear Admiral who was in charge of the D-Notice Committee at the time. And he said, you've clearly talked to a lot of individuals who perhaps you shouldn't have spoken to on one level, but I'm very glad you have, because you've written a story which is absolutely fabulous, doesn't reveal anything that shouldn't be revealed, and this story needs to be told. And then another example, I was approached by a senior guy, still serving actually, I mean, not now, but at the time, just about to leave. And he said, and I knew him through a friend, and we met up in London. He said, look, do you know about the SAS unit set up at the end of the war to hunt down the Nazi war criminals? I said, I know about that story. That is the most amazing story ever. It can never be told. There's just no source material. There's nothing available. He said, there is. He said, because we still study that operation at Hereford in the regiment, because that is the basis of war criminal hunting operations. And we do that kind of stuff. It's part of our remit. And he said, I'll provide you with materials, the materials we have, and that is your basis to start your research. And I said, why? He said, because we want that story told. We want this history on the record. We're talking 1945 through to 1948. He said, this is an incredible part of our history. If it's not told now, it will be lost. So sometimes it's good to put this stuff on the record, to get it documented before this incredible regimental history is lost. I mean, if it hadn't been for Paddy Mayne and others, for example, saving all the material they did against orders, because, of course, the SS was shut down in October 1945. It was killed off. All the documents were to be destroyed. There was to be the regiment was, they got it done away with because they weren't popular. And so if individuals like Paddy Mayne and others had disobeyed orders and denied what they were told to do and kept those incredible records that they did, which went on to become the SAS War Diary, that parts of even the World War II history would be lost. So it's about getting that balance right.
You made me think of a really good question for Chris and Des now. Thanks for that, Damien, because I'm thinking about the fact that living in Normandy as I do, the generation of all the staff rides coming here has mostly passed, because as much as you can still learn about leadership and teamwork on the battlefield, the wars of 2022 are very different now to the wars of 1944. So, looking at Operation Goodwood, there aren't many parallels you can make probably with modern warfare, but the core idea about what a regiment like the SAS do, which is stealth and secrecy and going in with a small team of people to do something very specific, that's still very, very relevant today. So Chris and Des as well, how much do you draw on what the regiment did in World War II in terms of instructing today's generation or your generation of SAS? I mean, there must be lots of things, as Damien said there, that are still absolutely the same methods today and then. What would you say to that, Chris?
Well, you're absolutely right. I'll give you an example. Jack Sillitoe walked 110 miles in an escape and evasion during the Second World War, and as a young SAS soldier, I just thought, they're the founding fathers. They're dinosaurs. We've moved on. We've got all of this fancy kit. It'll never happen. And then I end up having to walk nearly 200 miles doing the same thing. And I'll tell you what, I thought about that man every night when I was walking.
No, really?
Yes, you're damn right. And I just
seriously, that is amazing.
I just kept thinking. I used to total up every night.
How did you know about his story?
Reading all the historical accounts of him from back in the day, and in fact, he used to be mentioned from the instructors on combat survival. Now, never thinking, I'd be there by myself, trudging through the desert and cracking on, and it got really interesting when I got to the 110-mile point. And I thought, I've done it. I've got another 3 days.
Was it like those old football league things where you move the position up the chart? Did you move yourself up higher in your mind?
No, but you know what? It's basic things that boost your morale when everything's down. There's something bad happening every night. You lie up, you're freezing cold, you've lost colleagues, and then it's a little thing like that. You get stuck in your mind, and this is a trait I think from SAS soldiers. Just a little thing boosts you, and you're like, "Damn it, I'm pushing on. I'm going to make 120, 130, 140, and then I'm like, get in."
But the other thing about that is, Sillitoe's story is amazing. It's a fantastic escape story, but very, very little documented, actually, which is why I asked you how you knew about it. But the thing is, he was escaping across the Sahara in blistering heat. You were escaping invasion in the worst, and you, Des, were operating in the worst Iraqi winter in living memory. The conditions were totally different.
I mean, the bottom line is both as bad as each other, may I say. Obviously, Vince and Legs Lane died of hypothermia. It took them, but on the other hand, if you're in searing conditions, it's going to take you as well. So you're at the hands of Mother Nature, really, and this is where your basic skills come in. And now, it doesn't matter where the guys go in the future, in the next few decades. They'll obviously they're going to specialize more in a digital threat, in the technical side of what the enemy has against them. But when it all comes down, that Murphy's Law is the radio will stop, the chopper will crash, you'll end up walking, you'll have lost your compass. The stars are up there, the moon's up there, the sun's up there, and now I need a drink to find water. And this is another thing that I hope the regiment never ever lose, is the basic soldiering skills of a human being. They keep that, and they keep that polished, and then they adapt, and then they do all their specialist skills, and that's what sets them above everybody else. They have this thing of being able to survive in some of the worst places on this planet, but yet, they can operate and take targets down.
And Des, I guess you want to jump in on that, because as we said earlier, you've got the legacy SAS and parachute regiment. So in your case, sorry, I'll let you speak, but you've got these historical events. Sorry, I'll let you talk.
I remember when I was serving and I hadn't been up there too long, and I was talking to a senior staff sergeant, And, you know, we were talking about, you know, the success of the regiment. And he said something what Chris had said. He says, we haven't become dinosaurs there. I was like, what do you mean? He goes, well, you know, what happened to the dinosaurs? It become extinct. And he says, what the regiment's very good at, he says, we adapt and we evolve over the years. And he talked about, you know, how we started in North Africa in desert warfare. Then he talked about how the regiment went to Europe and we had European warfare. Then he talked about the Malayan conflict in the late 50s, early 60s, and how successful they were there. And bringing it all the way up to date was when I was very good at for example, let's say Chris has been, you know, Chris was on training wing. He's been to, and the jungle, for example, is an area within selection that is used all the time. And we're saying that one of the reasons we use the jungle is that because it's a very, very difficult and testing environment. The point I'm making is that every theatre that we go in and every conflict, we have this thing called the lessons learned. And we go, what lessons did we learn? So I think the regiment's very good at tapping ourselves on the back and say we did very well there, but we're also very good at saying that didn't work too well. How can we make it better next time? So the point I'm making is that the regiment's very good at moving on. It's very good at evolving. It's very good at not becoming extinct. And another thing that Chris said there is that I remember saying to the senior staff sergeant, saying, well, you know, what makes, you know, we're talking about the SAS soldier. And he said again, he said, as long as we keep to the selection process, where the selection process selects the individual for the job itself, in other words, a stressful situation, the SAS soldier, as long as we don't change that selection process, and by the way, it's been going since the 50s, he says it will always produce the SAS soldier. He says, if they turn round, the powers to be, and say, we need more SAS soldiers, and they change the selection process, in other words, allow more guys to get in, that would be the downfall of the special forces, in this case, the SAS soldier. And I'm sure Chris will agree with that. Chris was on training wing, so knows more about, you know, bringing in or bringing through guys through that selection process. And the staff sergeant said to me, as long as we don't water down that process, that selection process of choosing the SAS, that individual, we will always, no matter how many years in the future the SAS goes on, we will always have that same individual. But if it gets watered down, that will be the end of the SAS.
Chris?
Yeah, no, there were several occasions, sadly, where the CEO took upon himself to say, if any man passes the hills phase, when he goes to the jungle, everybody gets a pass. And actually, the jungle phase is the most important phase, and that's where you understand your student, and you know if he's right for that regiment. And on one particular selection, there was about 10 guys passed in there. A lot of them got RTU'd. Sadly, some of them were killed. On one selection that I was when I was part of the team running, several guys didn't finish long drag. And because they were short on numbers, they went out to the jungle, and 2 of them guys are dead. Now, Des knows these guys because they were killed in Bosnia in a car crash. And it's not right. As he said, you have a selection process. It should stick to the rules, and that's it. And it doesn't matter if you just get one guy at the end of selection. You're better off just having that one guy, and then other than 10 guys who shouldn't be there, and they're putting themselves in danger and other men in danger. And that's why we have that process.
And Damien, I'm going to bring you in because both Chris and Des mentioned that adaptability, and that's something that you have been writing about and talking to me about a lot, because as you said earlier today, I think the SAS survived more attempts to get rid of it during World War II than it survived engagements with the enemy in many ways. The powers to be behind it were against it from the beginning. The establishment was against it. So the debt you owe Sterling and Maine and the others in terms of the combat prowess, you also owe them this debt of just sheer persistence and survivability against against authority. So it seems to me that although we're talking about the current SAS and the era that the guys are in, the essence of what the SAS is about was created and has not changed since the days of 41, 42.
Yeah, I mean, they those guys who stepped forward to volunteer in the summer of 41, when Sterling had his big idea to form the SAS. Bear in mind, nearly all of them were veterans already of number 8, 7, 8, and 11 Commando. These were guys who'd been through months and months and months and months and months and months of intensive commando training, in Scotland on the Isle of Arran. The Lamlash pier leaps where they would jump off the end of the pier in full gear and have to swim to shore. The trainee assaults on RAF air bases where they were ordered to or instructed to make their way onto the RAF air base without being detected, and the first thing they would do is attack the officers' mess and grenade it. So they'd already been through. They were already this elite cadre of those from those 3 commandos, and so they were taken from that level and then elevated to a new, even more elite level, which was SAS training. And you had the beginnings, the foundations laid by people like Jock Lewis, who was the initial training officer. It was a superlative, desert survival specialist already. He had already been, and Jock Lewis, as an example, soldiering on the outskirts of Tobruk. He had led what was known as the Tobruk Four, and these were 4 guys, all of whom, in fact, came into the SAS in the early originals, and they had gone out at night from Tobruk long before the SAS was formed, and they'd gone out in the dark to go behind enemy lines and nick, serving soldiers from the other side to bring back prisoners, and they'd usually surprise them when they were out in the bush having a crap, and drag them back to our lines to gather intelligence. So, those kind of founding precepts of what the guys inherit today, they had that long gestation through the Commando, through people like Jock Lewis and the Tobruk Four and other small units like that, and all of that then brought into the SAS under Sterling and Main and the founders, and then jacked up to a whole new level. So yeah, that's where the foundations were laid. And going back to what the guys are talking about in terms of the mindset of the guy who gets through selection. It's a fascinating story, which is in Brothers in Arms. And we're going back to that, we've all talked about the first successful SAS mission, the raid on Tamet, where Paddy Mayne leads the 6 individuals, and the first thing they do is they assault the officers' mess and they kill all the pilots in there. We know why they did that. We've explained that. But really interestingly, okay, so Paddy Mayne has 2 guys on his shoulder when they kick the door in and open fire. One of them is an individual who he said was fantastic behind a Tommy gun, a real born gunman and killer. But he had an absolute foul mouth on him. He was swearing the whole time, just the whole time. Came from the East End of London, swore the whole time. And he bought the wrong attitude, because with that, there was... It's going to sound a strange thing to say, because we think of them as piratical and ill-disciplined. They weren't ill-disciplined. They were self-disciplined. Does that make sense? Do you understand the difference? They weren't disciplined because they were ordered to dress in a certain way and polish their boots in a certain way and wear certain blanco. They were disciplined in themselves. That self-discipline was absolutely key. And Mayne saw in that individual he didn't have it. And shortly after that raid, where he did a sterling job on Mayne's shoulder, he returned him to unit. It goes exactly back to what you 2 guys were saying. You've got to keep the caliber of the people in these units absolutely where you need it, because it's the key building block. It's the foundation.
There's a thing called... Sorry, go on, Des, after you.
Yeah, sorry. Self-discipline is the hardest discipline, And for me, I come from Para-Reg, and going from Para-Reg is very much stick your chest out. You wear the maroon beret, the maroon machine. Everybody tells you you're the best. When there's a fight, they're always going to send the paras in. We get the job done, we get out, and it's all about being bravado, if you like. And I mean that with respect. I was no different. But when I went to the regiment, and I nearly come unstuck, and I say it in the book in Bravo 30, is that I had the wrong attitude going up there. I was loud, I was brash, I had that parachute regiment attitude. Now, that works, okay, when you're going in and you need to punch through, you need to fight. That parachute regiment attitude works. But however, being a special forces soldier in the SAS, and you're doing a lot of covert operations, and Damien just mentioned about having the wrong attitude. I come unstuck a few times, and there's no shouting at you. They just speak to you normally, and that self-discipline a lot of people don't have. And of course, within the regiment, I keep saying it, in the regiment, the SAS, it says it on the can, you're going to be in very, very stressful situations. You're working in 4 or 6 or 8 man patrols. You've got to have very, very strong discipline. And if you don't have that, Chris talked about that selection process, and Damien's just mentioned the wrong individual. If you don't have that self-discipline, you can be dangerous to the other people within that patrol. So the self-discipline is paramount here, because especially being behind enemy lines and working in small units, sometimes you're by yourself. This discipline, okay, will win the day. And again, it's the heart of that special forces mindset. You've got to have control. Your mind is the temple for the body. If you don't have control over this, that self-discipline, you don't have control over your body. So it is paramount to have this self-discipline. I haven't met anyone in the SAS that doesn't have this strong self-discipline. And I think Chris will be able to elaborate on this, especially Chris being on training wing, bringing guys through selection itself. You can see it straight away from guys that just don't have it early on. You've got to have the self-discipline. It's paramount. What do you think, Chris?
Well, I think the biggest thing, it's controlled aggression. And that is a very important. But another point, the SAS sends small groups around the world in training teams. And I think this is a great skill, certainly the British soldier has, to, when you meet soldiers, to have an understanding of their customs, their religious beliefs, and just basic manners. We never ever bull on in there, see these guys and like disrespect them. You take them as they are. You win over these guys, and then you train them. And it's having a bit of respect. Now, I have the highest regard for our American cousins, but I've seen them doing the same type of job as the regiment, and they just can't match us. They will come in and they're American and they want to stick stars and stripes on them, and this is the way to go, and this is what we're doing. Where we would come in fact, one of the most embarrassing things was I was in Oman, and the local guys that we were training, the Sultan Special Forces, they put a meal on. It was the goat, and there was a couple of American guys there. They just dived in with both hands, and they were tearing pieces of meat off with their left hand, and the local guys were looking in horror, and just looked around at the regiment guys, so they didn't make a mistake. They're all sitting on the left hand, picking with the right, and just eating. Little things like that, an understanding of when do these guys pray, what is the protocol about meeting their family, and you have to know all of that, even if you're wearing rags and you've got dirty boots. You have to know, can you touch somebody? If you're in Israel, for instance, don't grab the Orthodox soldier there and move them around and touch them, because there is a protocol there. It's the same as if you're in the Middle East and there's female soldiers there. There's a protocol in terms of who speaks to that lady, not go in there and just stamp it on there. Now, this is what the regiment's great at, is winning hearts and minds. But if I can just go back a step, I would say the regiment can be sneaky buggers as well. Because there's a point on selection where it's combat survival, and where we were always short for men coming on to selection. Now, when we got to combat survival, we didn't have enough students to run a course, because you're bringing in an infantry unit as a hunter force. So we would put it out to other regiments that if they could send their motivated troops to come on combat survival, they will, at the end, if they finish and they're successful, they will become combat survival instructors. So, of course, the regiments are going to send their best soldiers down and motivated soldiers. So what we do is then we split all the SAS students up into patrols and integrate maybe 3 or 4 guys from outside units, knowing very well that these guys are going to become very good friends. They're going to have close bonds, and in 6 months' time, these guys are going to come on selection, and you've just poached some guys from them. So it's adapting and understanding the position that you hold.
No, it's great points, and I'm the things you said there about self-discipline and discipline, and Damien about this controlled aggression, controlled aggression. I think now is the time we should bring up the elephant in the room, and that's the BBC series SAS Rogue Heroes, because I enjoyed it because I love the music, and if you think I'm wrong for enjoying it, that's fine. We're all different as a piece of entertainment. But one of the things I can definitely see about the series is that it was straddling the line between the guys being a disorganized group of pirates, as Damien said there, and being a sort of disciplined regiment. And maybe the tone shifted a little bit as the series went on in how they're portraying them. So there's you have seen it. Chris, have you seen the show?
Yeah.
So Des, what did you think of it, basically?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, people kept saying, "Oh, have you seen the series on telly?" I said, "No, I haven't." So what I had to do is watch it in a full block, just because that many people were asking me. It's always difficult, isn't it? When they talk about things of the past, and especially my regiment, there's always going to be a dramatization of this. But I looked at the positive on it, and what I did like, I like the history of it. I like it that they talked about the beginning of the regiment. They talked about the 3 main characters in it. Sterling and Maine and Jock Lewis. And I liked that they had the authenticity of the, talk about out in Africa, when we were formed in 41 in the summertime, and particularly about the operations. The first one that we mentioned, Operation Squatter, how the S.A.S. nearly ended before it started. Damien talks about that in his book. So what I got from it, I like the history of it. I like that the authenticity of it. As far as portraying the characters, you've always got to kind of go, okay, I think they showed them in fairly good light, and I know there's been quite a bit of positive response from it, but on the whole, it was fairly okay. The history and the authenticity, especially, it showed you the tactics, the jeeps, the equipment, and what have you, and the feel of what happened out in Egypt and North Africa, the start of the regiment. But particularly what I did like, and the theme has been on this show tonight, is that it showed what type of guys, that started the S.A.S. then, and I feel that they're still in the S.A.S. today. I like that they portrayed that do or die tour spirit, that who dares wins, that get up and go, let's get the job done. That it's a difficult situation. I tell you what, I'm not going to whinge and whine and bellyache. Let's get on and get the job done. I like that they portrayed that. And I think if there's anything that you must take from this series, is that itself. Because when I looked at that, and I thought, yes, for me, I'm proud to be in the regiment. I served a long time in it. And over the years, I've seen what it takes to be a special forces operative, and especially to be in the SAS. And in the series itself, I think they've captured that about the heart of an SAS man, of what it takes, to be special forces within my regiment. I like that.
And Chris?
Great music. No, great actors. And as a drama, and remember, it was a drama, I thought makeup, the wardrobe, all did a great job. I thought it was unnecessary for the hints or bringing in sexuality, certainly to Colonel Maine, who, he was one of the highest decorated officers in the SAS, and, as a British soldier. He was an Ulsterman. I know his family. And what I find strange is I spoke with all of these originals, and nobody ever came up with any of this, any of these little hints. Now, I could be wrong, but I suspect when Ben McIntyre wrote the book, he knew the interest would all be surrounded around Colonel Maine, so he said something controversial. Now, the director's obviously taking his character from that novel. First of all, I think the actor who played Maine was miscast. Colonel Maine was a giant of a man. I just hope if there's a follow-up, it's Damien who is the advisor and not Ben McIntyre.
I'm for that. I'd vote for that. Yeah, no. I mean, Damien, have you seen it? Because you haven't
Go on,
seen
I'll
it
vote
last
for that
time.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I've watched it, and I think the guys have made really good points. It's a drama. It's a drama, and it's a drama. We have to remember it's a drama. It's not a documentary. It's not real life. The music is fantastic. Actually, the tradecraft is really good. Scenes are, wonderfully filmed and wonderfully authentic. The portrayal of Paddy Mayne is troubling for the reasons that Chris has mentioned, and because he was a towering figure to those men he commanded, and some of them are still alive. And I've spoken to those who are still with us, and before those who've sadly passed away, and I've never had any of them, and I've never read anything from all those individuals who served under him, which is anything other than, remarks to the effect that this man was a towering individual who we would follow into the depths of hell. This man was held in reverence. Just give you one example, right? Just one example, okay? When the SAS was reformed in the 1950s, and they got their sergeant's mess back, yeah? And you guys, Des and Chris, you'll understand what the sergeant mess means, what it signifies, okay? Whose portrait was first hung on the wall of the SAS's sergeant mess, which was commissioned for and paid for by the men? It was Colonel Maine's. So he is arguably the most highly decorated British Army soldier of the Second World War. DSO, Distinguished Service Order, and 3 bars, Croix de Guerre, Légion d'honneur, and any number of other foreign decorations. His record and the esteem he was held in by his men, and is still held in by those veterans who are alive today, and is held in by guys like you, Chris, and you, Des, and so many other modern day veterans of the regiment I've spoken to. That deserves respect. The series is being recommissioned. It's going to, it will go forward, and we live in hope that he will be portrayed more accurately and more as is befitting a man of his standing. And I look forward to that being the case. But I celebrate the fact they've made the series and they've brought World War II history to a younger, wider audience. Millions of people have watched it, and millions of people will, all over the world, and they can go and read the books. They can read Chris Ryan's History of the Regiment. They can read SAS Brothers in Arms. They can go and read the true stories. They can read my book based upon Paddy Mayne's War Chest, which is From the Horse's Mouth, which his family read, which one of the surviving aunts in the Mayne families who's in her 90s read and said, finally, the truth has been told. Now, this is important. The truth, I'm not saying, it's drama, okay? It's TV drama. It's like a feature film. It's based upon a true story. But the truth is also important with people of this stature. And so go and buy the books which you can read and learn about these extraordinary, inspirational individuals who, and that's just one final thing from, on this point, because I think this is really important. And guys, I'd love your thoughts on this, right? Because this has changed with your generation, okay? Paddy Mayne died at the age of 40. Bill Fraser Lieutenant Bill Fraser, who on those first missions, successful missions, destroyed 37 warplanes, and in his 2-line report afterwards said, "Yeah, we destroyed 37 warplanes. My greatest regret is that we left 2 untouched." What a man! Bill Fraser, unsung hero of the SAS. Seriously, Bill Fraser.
Yeah, no, it's
Terribly troubled by alcoholism after the war, died an early death. I can give you any number of other stories. Why did they all die an early death? Well, I'll tell you why. And this is absolutely, I'm convinced it's true, right? And I had the manuscript of Brothers in Arms read by a post-traumatic stress disorder expert in the UK, Ros Townsend, who works for PTSD Resolution. She said, one of these operations is enough to give you enough trauma to be plagued by it for the rest of your life. 5 years of repeated back-to-back operations behind enemy lines, seeing these men on your shoulder you've grown so close to, who are your brothers in arms, who you love in that platonic way that, you know, so you as guys as soldiers, and I as someone who's been on the front line with soldiers will understand, to see them, you know, injured, wounded, killed, dying, captured, to have to go and knife to death, you know, any number of German sentries up close, soaked in blood yourself. She said, 5 years of back-to-back, it's impossible you would not come home terribly, terribly traumatized. And then you get home terribly traumatized, and what happens? You're plagued by it, and you're seen as being sick and weak and a shirker, whatever it might be. Utterly, utterly destroying. This has changed. This is one thing that's changed in the modern day with, you know, with not just soldiers, but other people who are put in traumatic situations, which is a very good thing. So these guys that we're talking about from the Second World War, you know, some of them didn't just pay, you know, with all the trials and tribulations they went through the war, but they continued paying after the war, and they went to their early graves.
Well, I'll ask Chris and Des's opinion on that, but I think just to phrase it, my thoughts on this is that everything I've read about the TV show since it came out has all brought up the subject of main sexuality, and as I said, we don't know anything. You know, everything you've said, there's no evidence of it anyway. But the discussions that are worthy of having, well, you've just said it yourself there, Damien, is what toll did it take on these men? That's a discussion that should be happening around the world. Is if you're serving in this length of time in that hostile environment with that amount of tension and risk and danger, that's something to talk about, not whether or not Paddy Mayne was homosexual or not. It's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, look, just on that point, because it's been brought up. Sorry, I just got to say this. Look, I've studied every document there is. Okay, there is zero evidence. There is none. If someone can produce it, please send it to me. And when I'm saying evidence, I'm talking stuff from the time. So that's reports or prima facie accounts by people. There's no evidence. There's lots of evidence of Paddy Mayne and Ian McGonigal going out in the town. Ian McGonigal, his friend from Southern Ireland, Southern Irish Catholic. You know, Ian was you know, he was absolutely, he was for the blondes. Paddy was for those with, you know, the dark-haired beauties. There's lots of evidence of Paddy Mayne and his relationships with the fairer sex. There is none on the other side. So okay. I know where it's come from. It was invented, in my view, by an individual a couple of decades ago. I'm not going to go there, but there is no evidence. So that one needs to be killed dead. And you're absolutely right, Paul. There are serious issues this throws up, and the whole thing about PTSD for me is one of the key ones, because it's just not talked about. It wasn't just the fact that these guys suffered for 5 years. They then suffer for decades afterwards in shame and silence. And yes, they drank too much. And yes, they became violent and they were troublesome. But, as Ros Townsend, the expert, said to me, it's not a wonder why he died at the age of 40. We should wonder how he survived so long.
How he lived that long, yeah. So Chris, there's comments on that, PTSD,
This was an interpretation from an academic, and his interpretation of why Paddy Mayne was so aggressive and angry that he was actually hiding something. He was hiding a sexuality, which is absolutely nonsense. He was a man who'd been tasked to kill as many Germans as possible, and he was going to fulfill that order. Now, there is a scene where one of the young men is separated from an operation, and Colonel Mayne goes out night after night looking for him. Well, I can tell you something because I've got experience of this. After leaving Vince to die out in the desert, I was racked with guilt. And if I had actually been on other operations and another fellow member from my patrol had gone missing, I would go out looking for that man night after night after night. And not because he was a lover or for any other reason, that you are racked with guilt, that you have come back, you're a survivor, and they have perished, they have died. It's shocking, but I still suspect Paddy Mayne was singled out because we're even talking about it. And it's wrong. He was a soldier, as we've said before. I would follow him through the gates of hell because he wouldn't have asked me to. He was just an unbelievable man. He was an Ulsterman. And I can remember speaking to his brother who had his 38, and I'm going back to 20 plus years, maybe 30 years. And his brother offered me his 38. And when I spoke with him, I asked him what he was like. And in his Northern Irish accent said he was a very angry man and he had an eye for the debutantes of Northern Ireland. Now, that painted a picture. And he liked to drink. And I'm sure, as brave as the man was, he was racked with PTSD. And he probably didn't even know about it. He just knew if he had a drink, it would disappear.
Point. Any comments, Des?
Yeah. I mean, I've always found this really strange, this talk about Paddy Mayne. I was in the regiment from anyone detrimental, not only about Paddy Mayne, but about any of the originals, Sterling and Jock Will and the likes, Jock Lewis. I never heard anything, and I was really surprised when they kind of focused on this. So for me, no, I think it's rubbish. I never heard anything about it. No one ever said anything about any of this, and I find it strange that the articles I've read and things that I've seen, that they tend to focus on this. As far as the PTSD and what have you, I tend not to comment on it too much. I talk around the country and it always comes up, and what I always say is look, I'm not kind of qualified on this. So what I do like now is that in probably nowadays, Chris, is that what I do like now is the solid professional organizations now. It's out in the open, and anyone that is suffering, that is serving, and veterans that are out now, these organizations that people can go to and get good help, So, but in our day, I remember talking to the doctor and saying, do you have anybody kind of come and see you about, they're having problems and what have you? He says, well, Des, he says, it's funny. He says, I get people come to me in aches and pains and colds and flu. And then the talk goes on to, well, I haven't been feeling too well and I'm feeling, lethargic, etc. So, the doctors were starting to recognize it, 30 or odd years ago. But yes, it wasn't out in the open like it is now. So I am really pleased that, it's recognized, it's seen. Chris, we've had a few friends that have lost, that have committed suicide and that are no longer here simply because of this illness.
Well,
Paul, can I just say one thing, man?
Yes.
Without sounding homophobic, I'm not. Anyone's sexuality is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It's the man himself, the soldier himself. And I just think it's unfair where Colonel Mayne isn't here and he can't answer back for himself. But it actually, in the big picture, it makes no difference. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've had loads of comments in the sidebar about inviting you gentlemen back again, and we'll see if we can make that happen in the new year. But just to finish today's show, because I've got another one starting in 25 minutes, because there's no rest for the wicked, just to kind of lighten the tone a little bit. I'm a D-Day expert, historian, whatever you want to call it. When the anniversaries of the D-Day landings come out, I brace myself for all the bollocks that does the routine, the newspaper headlines about the myths about D-Day, the myths about, and I raise my eyebrows at the same old things that get repeated. the SAS is in the forefront again. We established at the beginning. What are the things that you roll your eyes at, that the press, the public, the say about the SAS? There must be that one thing that is like chalk on a, fingernails on a blackboard that you go, oh God, here they go again about the SAS. So, Damien, you're the writer of the regiment. What is it that you see as the historian that you go, oh, why do they always get that wrong? So, Damien, you first.
What do they always get wrong?
There must be those things that they always put that thing in there that you must go, yeah, that just annoys me.
There's quite a few.
Okay. top three.
Where do you want me to start?
Be very careful, Damien.
Well, I mean, there are just parts of the history which are they're just forgotten. Like, for example, most people don't understand or miss or kind of forgotten the fact that, for a significant amount of time, the SAS was disbanded. We seem to think that it's always been this extremely popular brand name. It hasn't. I mean, look, even during the war, right? Paddy Mayne was in Paris, late 44, after France had been won, and Paddy Mayne basically held a press conference. And he held a press conference because they'd got pretty much no publicity at all. The SAS missions had got mentioned in the press, the big hoo-ha about them, but they were never, the credit was never given to that unit. It was it was a group of parachutists in North Africa, a group of parachutists in Italy, for the reasons of secrecy. So even, that late in the Second World War, they had very little publicity. They were, still incredibly unpopular with the high command. And so by the end of the war, October 1945, disbanded, Churchill voted out of power, they are for the dustbin. I think that we tend to forget the fact that the notoriety and the brand name and the popularity is a pretty recent thing. And the fact these guys are here, these storied veterans, Chris and Des, who've, not only served, but have carried out some incredible operations, which they've written about. And Chris, I'm really glad you mentioned your escape and having to leave your brother behind, because man, that must have been so tough. So I feel for you there. The fact we have these guys with us is per chance. This is not preordained. These guys are here. We still have this unit, but we're very lucky to do so because so many people wanted to do away with it and very nearly did. I think that part, which gets kind of washed away somehow in the reporting we have, that we need to remember that, because if it happened once, it could happen again. The tide could turn.
Great point. So, Des, what's the thing that you go, oh God, here they go? Well, there must be one thing. You're smiling. You're smiling.
Yeah, I tell you what it is, Paul, and it's kind of it's a funny thing, if you like. When I do talks, some people they go, "Oh, you're not as big as I imagined you to be," and what they imagine an SAS soldier to be is that they all expect to be 6'5", 25 minutes across the chest, a two grease in one hand and a black whip in the other, built like Captain America or looking like Terminator off Arnold Schwarzenegger films. And I said to people, but they always say, but we hear that you do extraordinary feats, and I explained to them, I go, well, look, we're all incredibly fit, but I says gym fitness and soldier fitness are completely different. Like soldier fitness is out in the elements, the wind, the rain, the cold, and, we're carrying our stuff on our back. So it's not like being in the gym and kind of lifting weights and what have you. And in my opinion, that sort of fitness is far more tougher fitness, if you like. And then besides, it's job orientated. Guess what? We're soldiers, so we have to be soldiering fit. And again, an SAS soldier, it says what it says on the can. We put under stress, we put out in arduous conditions, and so that is quite funny. People seem to think that an SAS soldier is, he has to be, as I say, look like Captain America. So I get that quite regular. And there's another thing that people said to me. A more serious one, if you like, is that, well, the SAS has a reputation of getting the job done. And I know what they mean by that. But Chris will agree with me on this, is that the regiment has a great respect for life. You soon realize that when you're in the regiment, it's not all about offensive. In fact, most of the stuff we do is covert, gathering of information. In fact, for most of the time, we will try our very best not to be offensive. We try our very best. We may go into a situation, we may police it, we may observe it, or come back with information, and then we say, look, we advise you to do it this way. We don't think it'd be offensive. We feel that it needs to be policed and go about it a different way. So everybody thinks that we're going there and, you know, and we do what we have to do. I get it. When the situation is difficult, well, then the job has to be done. But for the vast majority of time, we are gatherers of information. We are in a covert role. Okay. It's not all about being offensive. So those two things, one, an SAS soldier has to look a certain way, and another one is, yeah, they think that we go in there and we cause absolute mayhem, which is actually not the case. Would you agree, Chris?
Well, I would say speak for yourself as I take a breath in my 52-inch chest. And so I just want to debunk some of the myths Des has just said about us all getting on. Now, I'm sure he's going to remember this story because I can see it as clear as day. We were coming back from, I think it was the jungle, and we just got back to camp, and I was walking into the students' accommodation, and I looked across at the washroom and drying room, and I saw a set of boots attached to this camouflage uniform, and Des dragging this guy back into the shadows to teach him a lesson. Do you remember that?
Actually, I do, and I think me and Damien have mentioned it in the book. But
that's great.
So listen, people watching.
One other thing, I just want to debunk
this. Yeah, I'm actually in the pool now, aren't I? You know, you've let it out in the back now. Here's me trying to look all cool and good, and you know, butter won't melt in my mouth. But actually, that's it now. It's out now, isn't it?
Yeah. Just last thing to debunk. Ant Middleton was never in the SAS.
I thought you guys were all there bench pressing and we're putting, you know, olive oil on your muscles and wearing vests and playing volleyball like in Top Gun. I'm really disappointed that's not what you do of your weekends. That's really upsetting.
You've been reading my mail, Paul. You've been reading my mail, haven't you?
No, it's been a seriously good show, folks, and I can't thank you enough for coming on and being honest and open about this. And Damien, your insight, as always, is amazing. And Des and Chris, sharing that your experience has been absolutely amazing. But we'll bring things to an end, and I will extend an invitation you to come back, and maybe we could tackle PTSD, or we could tackle a particular aspect of the regiment's history or something. But it's been a delight talking to you, and the viewers have loved listening to you. So I'm going to end by saying Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all three of you, and for everybody watching. And any final comments, Damien? You're the historian here. You're the sensible one amongst us. Any kind of closing comments about the SAS as a regiment, as a force for the future?
Well, I mean, just as someone who writes a lot chiefly about the SAS in World War II, one of the most incredible things about it is the more you dig, the more you realise hasn't been told. I mean, guys, that's something I'm sure you'll be excited about. There are so many incredible missions and so many characters and individuals who just have never been written about. And, I mean, I've got 2 manuscripts sat here, right, that have been sent me over the past 3 months by the sons and grandsons of those who served in World War II, which have just, you know, never seen the light of day. And they've asked me to read them. And I've read them both, and they're awesome. There are lots and lots and lots of stories to be told, and that is a great thing. That's a great thing.
And we haven't touched, I mean, I'm World War II TV, but Malaya and Borneo and all that era there has not been touched on. I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan a little bit, but there's that middle chapter. Yeah. Extraordinary stuff that can be talked about. But we can do that for another day. But Chris, There's Damien. I'm going to bring things to the end because I've got another show. We're off to the 80th anniversary of the attack on Boona with Philip Bradley in 15 minutes. So I've got to get ready for that show, go for a quick winkle, and then come back. But guys, it's been great talking to you. As I say, Merry Christmas. Thanks, everybody. And thank everybody for watching. This is Paul Willis for World War II TV. Thank you, my incredible panel. See you all next time, everybody. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Merry Christmas,
Take care.
Happy New Year.
Cheers,
Merry
Andrew.
Christmas, Happy New Year. Cheers, guys.
Bye.